He was laundering millions in God's name. Pope Leo XIV has just shattered the silence within the Vatican, accusing Cardinal Luis Tagle of secretly operating an international financial network that funneled off-the-books church funds through shell NGOs and into politically connected foreign accounts. Hidden donations, ghost organizations, and leaked documents are now painting a damning picture of corruption cloaked in holiness. How deep does the deception go? Who else was involved? And why did the Vatican's most trusted figure become the center of one of the Church's most explosive financial scandals? Stay with us. This investigation is just beginning. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began not with a public trial or a press conference, but with a single, cryptic line whispered behind the Vatican's towering walls. He was laundering millions in God's name. In Rome, where secrets are older than stones and silence is sometimes more deafening than bells, this was not just gossip. It was a warning, a fuse lit under one of the most revered figures in the Catholic world. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, long considered a favorite to one day wear the papal crown himself, is now at the heart of an earth-shaking exposé. The man once called Asia's Francis for his humility, charm, and seemingly incorruptible demeanor has been directly accused by Pope Leo XIV of orchestrating a clandestine network of off-the-books Vatican funds, deeply intertwined with foreign political donations and ultra-secretive NGOs. The story, as explosive as it is delicate, has rocked the foundations of the Church like no event in the last 2 decades. It is not merely about money. It is about power, betrayal, and the sacred trust between the faithful and their leaders. And it all erupted when the newly elected Pope Leo XIV, known for his hardline approach to church governance and transparency, publicly acknowledged a previously secret dossier compiled by Vatican intelligence operatives, allegedly containing irrefutable proof that Cardinal Tagle was running a financial shadow operation. But how did we get here? How did one of the Vatican's most celebrated figures find himself under the microscope, not for spiritual guidance, but for financial subterfuge? To answer that, we must go back, not just to the day Pope Leo made his revelation, but to the day Cardinal Tagle first caught the world's attention. Luis Antonio Joaquim Tagle was born in Manila, Philippines, and rose through the church hierarchy with what many described as divine velocity. He was articulate, progressive, and embraced by the media as a modern face of Catholicism. Appointed Archbishop of Manila in 2011 and later brought into the Vatican by Pope Francis himself, Tagle quickly rose to the head of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, a role that put him in charge of overseeing the Church's missionary work across Asia and Africa. With that came not just spiritual influence, but access to enormous financial streams, donation channels, missionary budgets, and NGO partnerships. It was in this role, according to leaked documentation and insider accounts, that the seeds of the scandal were sown. Vatican insiders allege that over the years, Cardinal Tagle directed tens of millions of dollars into independent NGO pipelines, many of which were not audited by the Vatican's financial offices. These organizations, often registered in tax-neutral or politically shielded jurisdictions, funneled money to causes under the vague umbrella of evangelization or intercultural engagement. Yet the books rarely matched up. Some groups dissolved after 1 year of operation. Others had no physical address. Still others were linked to foreign political groups or even offshore shell entities. Pope Leo XIV, elected in a surprising turn following Pope Francis's abdication due to health concerns, was said to be obsessed with cleaning the Church of financial corruption. A career Vatican diplomat and canon lawyer with a reputation for ascetic discipline, Leo XIV came to power with one mantra: purge the rot. Shortly after his installation, he launched what insiders now refer to as Operation Pius, a Vatican-wide forensic audit led by private intelligence contractors and independent financial regulators brought in under papal privilege. Operation Pius eventually uncovered a series of memos and confidential banking documents that implicated several church figures in questionable financial activities. But one name appeared repeatedly, always in connection with international wire transfers, undisclosed donations, and suspicious NGO agreements: Cardinal Luis Tagle. What followed was a secret investigation. Pope Leo ordered Tagle's travel to be restricted without public explanation. Simultaneously, his closest financial associates within the Vatican departments were quietly replaced. No statements were issued, and no accusations were made. But the silence spoke volumes to those paying attention. Then came the moment that broke the silence. During a closed-door meeting with the College of Cardinals, Pope Leo XIV reportedly presented a sealed dossier titled Operatio Dei, Financial Pathways and Patterns in Modern Evangelization. According to leaks from those present, the dossier contained internal memos between Tagle and foreign benefactors, flagged bank transactions, and receipts of unexplained payments from Catholic NGOs based in Hong Kong, Zurich, and New York. One source, a senior Vatican archivist who later spoke anonymously to Italian journalists, claimed the dossier showed a parallel church operating without oversight, blessed by smiles, but paid for in silence. The Pope, often viewed as a by-the-book enforcer lacking the charm of his predecessor, reportedly stood before the cardinals and said, "Transparency is not betrayal. It is fidelity to truth." What followed was an ultimatum, a public audit of all NGOs associated with Tagle's office, a freeze on discretionary spending in the evangelization department, and an internal tribunal to review whether church laws had been violated. The world did not learn of these events through an official statement. Instead, the first leak came through a widely shared anonymous email sent to over 300 international Catholic journalists. The subject line read, "He was laundering millions in God's name." Attached were 3 pages from the supposed dossier, partially redacted, showing transaction chains and NGO registration documents with Tagle's signature. It was the first crack in a dam about to burst. In the days that followed, conservative Catholic blogs began publishing in-depth breakdowns of Tagle's NGO web. Filipino journalists, once loyal to Tagle as a national hero, demanded answers. The Vatican press office initially dismissed the claims as incomplete and misleading, but the growing weight of documentation forced them to release a statement. The Holy See is undergoing a comprehensive internal financial review. All departments, including the Dicastery for Evangelization, are subject to this review. The damage was done. The man who once walked with heads of state appeared on Time magazine covers and was seen by millions as the hope for a more inclusive, modern Catholicism was now shrouded in accusations of financial impropriety, deceit, and manipulation of church assets. But the story does not end with the accusations. In fact, it is just beginning. Because this is not just about one man's fall from grace. It's about what happens when the divine trust placed in spiritual leaders is used to build something far darker than a mission, something resembling a machine, powered by dollars and cloaked in piety. And now, the world waits. Will Pope Leo XIV follow through with ecclesiastical trials? Will civil authorities in Italy, the Philippines, or the U.S. press charges? And perhaps most critically, what will this scandal mean for the future of a church already battered by decades of cover-ups and crises? As we delve deeper into this investigation, we will examine every piece of the puzzle. The rise of Tagle, the moment Leo took charge, the hidden finances, the NGO web, and the betrayal that has left millions questioning once again, who can be trusted at the highest levels of the church. This is the story of ambition cloaked in holiness, a tale of whispered warnings and broken silence. And perhaps, just perhaps, a moment when the Vatican, for once, couldn't bury the truth fast enough. Before the scandal, before the leaks, before the shocking Vatican dossier surfaced, Cardinal Luis Tagle was a symbol of spiritual hope and theological renewal. For millions across Asia and beyond, he represented what the Catholic Church could be: humble, grounded, compassionate, and modern. To understand the gravity of Pope Leo XIV's accusations against him, one must first understand the magnitude of Tagle's ascent within the Church and why his fall, if proven true, will be one of the most devastating betrayals of trust in contemporary church history. Luis Antonio Gokum Tagle was born on June 21, 1957, in Manila, the Philippines. He came from a deeply religious Filipino-Chinese family. His upbringing was rooted in Catholic devotion, communal service, and the Filipino value of pakikipagapwa, a sense of shared humanity. It didn't take long for young Luis to show signs of profound religious insight. By his teenage years, teachers described him as reflective, exceptionally articulate, and deeply empathetic. He often volunteered for church activities, and his sermons, even at a young age, carried a maturity that surprised adults. Tagle entered seminary formation with remarkable ease, distinguishing himself not just through intellectual achievement, but through his calm presence and unshakable humility. He studied at the San Jose Seminary in Quezon City and then earned his licentiate and doctorate in sacred theology from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. There, he focused his dissertation on the evolution of episcopal collegiality, a topic that would later echo through his administrative reforms and pastoral ideology. But it was not merely his education or intellect that caught the attention of the Vatican. It was his blend of spiritual sincerity and media-savvy charisma. Tagle had a natural ability to speak plainly yet profoundly. He could explain complex theological principles to laypeople without ever sounding patronizing. More than once, comparisons were drawn between him and a young Pope John Paul II, both intellectually sharp, deeply spiritual, and incredibly adept in public appearances. In 2001, he was appointed Bishop of Imus, a province in the Philippines, where he spent 10 years transforming the local church landscape. Parishioners recalled that he would ride his bicycle around villages, making personal visits to the sick and elderly. He often refused pomp and ceremony, preferring instead to eat with locals in their modest homes. His sermons, broadcast on national television, began drawing wide attention for their emotional depth and social consciousness. He would speak of God's mercy, of justice for the poor, and the necessity of love that goes beyond ritual. It was this grassroots authenticity that caught the eye of Pope Benedict XVI, who in 2011 named Tagle the Archbishop of Manila, one of the most influential ecclesiastical positions in Southeast Asia. The promotion was significant. Tagle was now one of the youngest and most visible bishops in the global church. His appointment sent waves of hope across Asia, where Catholics had long felt underrepresented in the Vatican's Eurocentric governance structure. The momentum didn't stop there. In 2012, Pope Benedict elevated Tagle to the College of Cardinals. His red hat signaled that he was not just a local bishop anymore. He was now part of the inner sanctum of global church decision-making. He sat in conclaves. He contributed to papal discussions. He had a vote in choosing the next pope. With his rapid rise, quiet whispers began circulating that Cardinal Tagle could, one day, be that next pope himself. But it was under Pope Francis that Tagle's star reached its zenith. Francis, elected in 2013, was on a mission to reshape the church, to open it up, modernize its governance, and emphasize mercy over judgment. Tagle became a vital instrument in that vision. Both men shared pastoral sensibilities. Both wanted a church less obsessed with doctrine and more involved in real-world issues, poverty, injustice, environmental destruction. In 2015, during Pope Francis's visit to the Philippines, Tagle played a central role, not just as host, but as interpreter of the Pope's message to millions. Images of him embracing children, comforting survivors of natural disasters, and kneeling with the poor circulated globally. He was not only seen as a church leader, but as a moral guide for a region plagued with political corruption and inequality. International media outlets called him the Asian Francis. Time magazine listed him among the top 100 most influential people. What few outside the Vatican knew was that with each promotion came increased control over massive financial networks. As Archbishop of Manila, and later as prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, a powerful Vatican office, Tagle was entrusted with overseeing billions in church assets. These funds supported missionary work, charitable efforts, hospital projects, educational institutions, and Catholic NGOs around the world. The Evangelization Office was particularly influential because of its access to unrestricted funds. These funds came from global Catholic donations, often through second collection efforts in churches, or from wealthy benefactors eager to support causes in the developing world. Under Tagle, the office expanded its reach dramatically. New missionary programs were launched in South Asia, Eastern Africa, and the Middle East. Catholic-run foundations began working with non-Christian communities, promoting interfaith dialogue and social development. But here's where the lines began to blur. Unlike other Vatican departments, the Congregation for Evangelization had historically operated with looser financial oversight. Its origin dates back to a time when missionary work required fast and flexible access to cash in unstable territories. This allowed it to operate somewhat independently from the Vatican Bank and the Secretariat for the Economy. Critics had long warned that this autonomy could be misused. But under Tagle, the department's expansion brought new energy and new questions. Where exactly were the funds going? How were contracts awarded to NGOs and field organizations? Who was auditing the money sent abroad? These questions weren't loud at first. Tagle's image was nearly spotless. He remained popular even among skeptics of the Vatican. He continued to attend youth congresses, interreligious panels, and environmental forums. He championed Laudato Si', the Pope's encyclical on climate change. He wore plain clothes when visiting impoverished communities, sometimes mistaken for a lay missionary. In meetings with world leaders, he was eloquent but never grandstanding. He was diplomatic but never politically aligned. Still, there were whispers. A few concerned voices in the Vatican's financial offices quietly raised issues about misfiled transaction records and NGO partnerships that seemed unusually vague in their reporting. These voices, however, were drowned out by the louder chorus of admiration for Tagle's work. No one wanted to believe that the face of compassion could be hiding something. The deeper irony is that Tagle often spoke publicly about financial justice. He criticized materialism. He denounced consumerism in his homilies. He reminded the faithful that the Church's mission was to serve, not to profit. To many, these messages were more than just words. They were sermons lived out in real time. Few cardinals had such an unblemished public persona. He was seen as incorruptible. That perception made him all the more dangerous, according to Pope Leo XIV's camp. A figure so deeply trusted could, in theory, operate under a veil of sanctity, making even questionable activities appear noble. As one Vatican analyst put it, if you wanted to move money quietly through the Church, you'd want it passing through hands no one would suspect. And so we return to the man himself, sitting at the intersection of devotion and global influence. Tagle's rise was not a political campaign. It was a phenomenon. He was the priest who felt like a brother, the cardinal who seemed more comfortable holding a child than holding court. For years, the mere mention of his name in papal succession conversations elicited excitement, which is why the accusations have sent such a tremor through the Catholic world. This is not the fall of a bureaucrat. It is the fall, if the evidence holds, of someone who embodied the very future of the Church. A man whose image carried more moral weight than many of his peers. A man who may have used that very image as cover for the creation of a financial maze so vast and opaque that even seasoned Vatican accountants struggled to untangle it. If these allegations are true, the betrayal is not just legal, it is spiritual. And if they are false, then the question becomes even more sinister. Who would benefit from destroying Tagle, and why now? As we move into the next chapter, we must turn our attention to the other central figure in this unfolding drama, Pope Leo XIV. Who is this pope who dared to accuse a living symbol of Catholic virtue? Why did he choose to reveal the truth now? And what does this mean for the war brewing within the Vatican itself? When the white smoke billowed above the Sistine Chapel on that gray and anxious Roman afternoon, the world waited with familiar anticipation. Yet when the name was finally announced, Cardinal Giancarlo Serafini, now Pope Leo XIV, it was met with confusion and even skepticism. For many outside Vatican walls, it was not a name that had dominated papal speculation, not a face familiar to the global faithful, not someone backed by the progressive forces that had rallied behind figures like Cardinal Tagle. But for those inside the Curia, the selection of Leo XIV was not only calculated, it was necessary. A choice born of quiet desperation, hidden conflicts, and mounting internal chaos. To understand how this unlikely pope rose to the throne of St. Peter, we must begin in the days leading up to Pope Francis's unexpected resignation. Though publicly framed as a move prompted by health and age, the truth, according to Vatican insiders, was far more complex. Francis, who had spent over a decade grappling with institutional resistance to reform, had grown weary. His emphasis on mercy over judgment, decentralization over central command, and dialogue over dogma had divided the Church as never before in the modern era. And beneath the theological debates, another, far more corrosive crisis was silently metastasizing. The financial rot festering in the Church's hidden accounts. Reports of embezzlement, shadow NGOs, and misused missionary funds had reached Francis's desk repeatedly. He had formed commissions, appointed watchdogs, even replaced entire departments. Yet the deeper he tried to clean the system, the more resistance he faced from the powerful financial wings embedded within the Church's infrastructure. A reckoning was approaching, and Francis, long a man of peace and pastoral gentleness, was not the one to lead a purge. That task, many whispered, would fall to his successor. And so it did. And yet, even with this document in hand, Pope Leo waited. He understood that publicly moving against Tagle, a global icon of Catholic humility, without complete evidence would trigger worldwide backlash. He also knew that if he waited too long, internal opposition could grow. A balance had to be struck, and that moment came during a meeting of the College of Cardinals. According to multiple sources, Leo XIV addressed the room with a calm but grave tone. He presented the dossier not as an attack on a person, but as a reflection of systemic failure. He did not accuse Tagle outright of criminal behavior. Instead, he posed a question to the cardinals. If even the most trusted hands can act without scrutiny, how long before trust itself becomes a liability? Some cardinals were stunned. Others applauded. A few were furious. Tagle himself, it is said, remained silent during the presentation, offering no rebuttal. He did not protest, did not walk out. Instead, he reportedly sat with eyes downcast, hands folded, like a man hearing a eulogy spoken over his own name. From that moment forward, Pope Leo XIV became a different kind of pope, not a theologian in robes, but a spiritual auditor with a sword. He began restructuring the financial arms of the Vatican. New oversight bodies were introduced. Independent auditors were made permanent. Transparency protocols were implemented, and church funds were reclassified and traced through modern compliance systems. Leo XIV knew his mission would cost him allies. He knew it would tarnish the church's image in the short term. But in his own words, delivered in a rare homily weeks after the dossier's presentation, better the wound that heals than the rot that hides. The Lord does not dwell in silence built upon fraud. As this new papacy continues to unfold, one thing has become clear: Leo XIV is not here to be loved. He is here to uproot. And in the process, he has turned the spotlight on Cardinal Tagle, shaking the very foundations of what many believe the Church's future leadership might look like. What remains uncertain is how far Leo XIV will go. Will he push for a formal trial? Will he demand public apologies? Or is his purpose to set a quiet example, using Tagle as both warning and catalyst? What is certain is this: under Pope Leo XIV, no cardinal, no matter how beloved, is beyond investigation. And the Church, once hidden behind sacred walls, is now facing a long-overdue reckoning in the light. For years, the reputation of Cardinal Luis Tagle stood as a model of virtue within the global Catholic Church. He was the people's cardinal, soft-spoken, approachable, with a disarming smile that could melt any theological argument into brotherly conversation. Tagle stood on stages across the world, preaching about mercy, humility, and servant leadership. To many, he was not only a spiritual force but a political bridge between East and West, between old Catholic tradition and a younger, more inclusive church. That image, so delicately built and widely embraced, was his greatest strength. It also became the perfect cover. The unraveling of that image didn't begin with an explosive scandal or a whistleblower's testimony. It began with whispers, quiet questions in underlit hallways of Vatican departments, soft concerns passed in coded memos, subtle discrepancies buried in spreadsheets too small to cause alarm, but too irregular to be ignored. The first to notice these irregularities was a mid-level auditor working under the Secretariat for the Economy. Tasked with reviewing NGO expense reports for a fiscal review cycle, she noticed something strange. A series of transfers, each modest on its own, had been authorized from the Vatican's Missionary Fund account to a charity registered in Singapore under the name Stella Via Foundation. The organization claimed to provide scholarships to children in remote regions of Southeast Asia. Its website was minimal, containing only vague statements about faith, youth, and intercultural dialogue. But something felt off. The auditor attempted to contact the foundation through its listed phone number and email, no response. She looked for their annual reports, none available. She called contacts in the Filipino Curia, asking if anyone had heard of this group or seen any evidence of their work in the region. Not one bishop recognized the name. Still, she filed it away, suspecting it may simply be a small operation with limited visibility. Weeks later, during a review of another account, a similar transaction pattern emerged, this time to an organization registered in South Korea, then another in Chile, and later one in Malta. The pattern was becoming clear. These foundations, tied loosely to evangelization programs, were receiving consistent transfers, often under $500,000, enough to avoid red flags, but with no visible project reports or field activity to justify them. She compiled a private report and forwarded it to her superior, a senior administrator with connections to the Secretariat for Evangelization. She received no response. Around the same time, two staff members working within the dicastery for evangelization raised parallel concerns. They noticed that grants were being approved for NGOs that were not undergoing standard vetting procedures. Normally, to receive Vatican funds, an NGO would undergo rigorous spiritual, legal, and financial scrutiny. Background checks were standard. Leadership credentials, governance charters, local partnerships, everything had to be verified. But under Cardinal Tagle's tenure, the verification steps had begun to vanish. Files were being marked vetted without the attached documentation. Paperwork was being retroactively inserted. And in several cases, approval forms appeared to bear the cardinal's digital signature, dated before the actual NGO application had even been submitted. When one junior official asked for clarification, he was told to trust in the mission. Another was warned not to question directives from above. These rebukes were gentle but firm, enough to discourage further probing. Still, suspicions lingered. The Vatican's financial culture has long been plagued with opacity, a legacy of centuries of sovereignty and spiritual immunity. But under Pope Francis, there had been attempts to reform that culture. The establishment of the Secretariat for the Economy was part of that push. The hiring of external auditors. The publication of annual financial reports. Yet, some departments, including the dicastery for evangelization, remained walled off from full transparency. They operated with diplomatic immunity, spiritual authority, and historical autonomy. That's where the real vulnerabilities lay. Then came an internal tip, anonymous, but precise. A document was slipped into the secure inbox of a Vatican internal security officer. It contained a transaction log showing repeated payments from a Vatican account labeled Missionary Expansion Asia Division to a private bank in Zurich, under the name of a religious charity headquartered in Austria. The amounts totaled nearly $3.2 million over 2 years. The charity, Faith Horizons Europe, had been mentioned in passing at several donor meetings, but never formally approved by any oversight committee. Upon investigation, the charity was found to share a physical address with a company known for real estate acquisition in Vienna. This was the moment the concerns reached critical mass. The Vatican's Office for Financial Intelligence, informally known as Vatican, quietly began cross-referencing mission fund distributions from the past 5 years. The review uncovered a complex web of fund flows. Dozens of organizations across different continents had received structured payments, often just below threshold amounts that would require multiple sign-offs. Some of these groups existed solely on paper. Others had vague spiritual mandates but no clear deliverables or reporting mechanisms. In almost all cases, the approval trail led back to the same office, the desk of Cardinal Luis Tagle. Internally, questions exploded. Was this negligence or design? Was Tagle simply delegating too much authority, or was he leveraging his position to move funds through unofficial, untraceable pathways? This internal doubt only grew when two separate whistleblowers, a communications staffer in the Philippines and a logistics manager in Rome, came forward with emails referencing donor protocols that were not on file. One such email discussed redirecting unrestricted funds to a safer vehicle through inter-NGO cooperation. Another mentioned external benefactors with sensitive ties to political interests in Asia. Neither message explicitly named Tagle as the author, but both were forwarded through his office, with instructions to proceed. By this time, Pope Francis had already signaled that he was stepping down. A conclave was imminent, and factions within the church began positioning themselves for influence. Some viewed the unfolding irregularities as political sabotage. Others believed it was a genuine unraveling of something darker. Still, nothing concrete had reached the public or even most of the cardinals. It wasn't until Pope Leo XIV ascended to the papacy that these quiet whispers were transformed into investigative fire. Leo, with his deep understanding of canon law and church governance, demanded access to every report related to financial distributions from the dicastery for evangelization. He began calling in those who had filed concerns: clerks, secretaries, regional bishops. He listened quietly, asked for written testimony, promised confidentiality, and slowly, a larger picture began to emerge. This was not a case of one or two strange transfers. This was a system, a deliberate architecture of financial movement that relied on trust, ambiguity, and the near-mythical public image of Cardinal Tagle. His unassailable persona was the keystone that kept any scrutiny at bay. Even those with doubts felt reluctant to voice them, fearing they might damage the reputation of a man seen as a global symbol of good. The cracks were now visible. Tagle's image, polished, gentle, and universally admired, no longer concealed the irregularities mounting beneath it. For those within the Vatican who had idolized him, it was a painful reckoning. Some defended him, claiming he was being set up. Others began distancing themselves, realizing the weight of the evidence would soon become too much to ignore. And then, the first public ripple hit the outside world. A Catholic journalist based in Rome received an anonymous tip, along with 5 attachments: bank statements, NGO registrations, internal memos. The email subject line simply read, "Start here." Though the journalist didn't publish immediately, she began investigating. Over the course of 6 weeks, she quietly confirmed the existence of many of the organizations listed. Some were legitimate, others were not. And all roads, in terms of approvals and financial authority, led back to Tagle's tenure. She reached out to contacts in the Vatican press office. No official comment. She requested interviews with Tagle's staff. No reply. But then something unexpected happened. She received a second email. This time, it included a scanned memo from a private Vatican meeting, allegedly chaired by Pope Leo XIV himself. The subject line was more ominous, "They know." That was the moment she realized this wasn't just about suspicious finances. It was a looming confrontation between 2 factions of the Church, one driven by image and legacy, the other by institutional reform and painful accountability. The Vatican, once again, was about to enter crisis. As we turn to the next chapter, the internal warnings have now grown into systemic alarms. The audit teams are in place. The Pope has declared war on hidden corruption, and the world is beginning to listen. But what did those leaked memos actually contain? Who was behind the leak? And just how deeply did this shadow network go? The internal suspicions that had been brewing within the Vatican's financial departments for years erupted into full-blown scandal the moment a series of classified memos were leaked to the outside world. Unlike vague rumors or unverified whispers, these documents carried an unmistakable weight. They were detailed, specific, stamped with Vatican seals. Some bore the digital signatures of high-ranking officials. Others included handwritten annotations in the unmistakable cursive style of Cardinal Luis Tagle himself. The leak came in phases. The first set of documents, released anonymously to several independent journalists and Catholic investigators, consisted of 5 distinct memos dated between 2019 and 2023. Each one related to financial approvals or strategic partnerships between the Dicastery for Evangelization and various lesser-known NGOs operating in Asia, Eastern Europe, and parts of Africa. One memo, in particular, drew immediate attention. It was a formal authorization signed under Tagle's name approving a $1.2 million development grant to a Vienna-based organization known as the Christus Inter-Ultra Forum. The stated purpose of the funds was to support refugee integration and faith-based trauma counseling. But when journalists began digging, they uncovered a glaring problem. There was no evidence the organization existed beyond its website and a post office box. Further investigation revealed that the charity had filed no activity reports, hosted no events, and had no social media presence. More damning, the charity was administratively linked to a for-profit consulting firm owned by a former aide to a Filipino diplomat with known ties to controversial business networks in China. This was only the beginning. Subsequent memos revealed a consistent pattern. The Vatican, under Tagle's department, had been dispersing funds to NGOs with vague mission statements and little to no paper trails. These organizations operated in regions typically hard to monitor, such as border provinces in Myanmar, remote towns in Ghana, or sparsely populated zones in eastern Romania. In theory, these were the very places that needed missionary work and financial aid the most. But what the memos revealed was not aid, it was evasion. Evasion of Vatican audit protocols, evasion of reporting requirements, and, in some cases, evasion of international banking transparency laws. One memo, dated January 2022, was especially damning. It was addressed to a Mr. D in Geneva and included the following phrase: "As discussed, ensure conversion is completed before Q2 to minimize exposure. Continue routing through our standard faith hubs with designated fiscal identifiers. The office will process the cover sheet after confirmation." The memo bore an official watermark from the Vatican's Dicastery for Evangelization and ended with a handwritten note, LT, the initials that Vatican insiders immediately linked to Luis Antonio Tagle. The phrase, "minimize exposure," set off alarm bells across the media and within the church. What was the office trying to minimize? What was being converted, and from what to what? Why were funds being routed through faith hubs with fiscal identifiers not registered within the Vatican Bank's oversight grid? Pope Leo XIV, who had quietly received early drafts of the internal audit report by this time, was briefed immediately. By then, it was already too late to contain the public fallout. The documents were spreading online like wildfire. Catholic blogs translated the memos into multiple languages. Independent Catholic media outlets ran headlines such as Cardinal Tagle's NGO empire under Vatican fire and shadow charities linked to top prelate. In the Philippines, mainstream newspapers reluctantly covered the story, torn between national pride and growing concern. The Vatican's press office initially declined comment, releasing only a vague statement about the importance of transparency and discernment during ongoing financial reforms. Behind closed doors, however, chaos erupted. Emergency meetings were called between the Secretariat for the Economy, the Vatican Bank, and the Dicastery for Evangelization. Internal investigators requested immediate access to years of previously restricted archives. Staffers from Tagle's office were quietly reassigned. Some left the Vatican compound entirely. Several devices were confiscated and encrypted communications ordered to be decrypted by the Vatican's Internal Tech Task Force, known unofficially as Angeli Custodes, the guardian angels. The pressure mounted when a second wave of leaked memos appeared, this time including correspondence between the dicastery and a firm known as Pathlight Ventures, allegedly based in Dubai. The firm claimed to facilitate faith-based humanitarian logistics in high-risk regions. One memo included instructions for splitting donor funds into parallel accounts to avoid triggering international banking alerts. These instructions were buried within what appeared to be an innocuous proposal summary, but the attached spreadsheet listed entries that could not be ignored. Private flight cargo, Pakistan, $380,000, relocation fee, HK benefactor, $125,000, and conversion asset code. NZTT, C, Evangel Fund Path X/3. That final entry caught the attention of Pope Leo's core audit team. According to internal audit members who later spoke to investigative reporters under condition of anonymity, NZTT was a code name for a type of unreported offshore account allegedly used to store undisclosed church assets, typically from large donors requesting anonymity or political discretion. The fact that such a code appeared in Tagle's files, linked to non-governmental partners in volatile regions, sent a clear message. This was not mismanagement. This was orchestration. Back in Tagle's home country, reactions were mixed. Some loyal Filipino clergy refused to believe the memos were legitimate. "It's a hit job," said one Manila-based bishop. "They are afraid of a man who brings the true gospel to the poor. This is Vatican politics at its ugliest." But others, including younger Filipino seminarians and theology students, began asking hard questions. Why had there never been public reporting on how Vatican funds were used in Asia? Why did some Catholic projects appear only on paper? Why had so many financial decisions remained locked behind closed doors? As pressure built both within and outside the Church, Pope Leo XIV faced a critical decision. Should he move forward with a formal investigation of Tagle? Or should he allow the process to unfold quietly, preserving Church unity and avoiding further scandal? He chose neither. Instead, Leo XIV did something unprecedented. He allowed a controlled leak of selected contents from the Vatican's internal dossier. In collaboration with trusted Catholic academic institutions and two vetted international reporters, the Pope's office sanctioned the release of over 100 pages of anonymized financial data, NGO registration audits, and annotated approvals from Tagle's administration. This release was made through a third-party religious media consortium and came with a signed letter from Leo himself, stating, "The Church is not built upon the image of man, but on the truth of Christ. Where that truth is obscured by misused funds, exploited trust, or deliberate deceit, we are called not to conceal, but to confront." The impact was immediate. Parishes across Europe and Latin America held emergency donor meetings. Catholic universities began issuing public statements. Clergy who had once welcomed Tagle into their diocese with honor now found themselves distancing from his legacy. The Vatican suspended multiple NGO partnerships within days, initiating a full restructuring of the dicastery for evangelization. Most notably, Cardinal Tagle was quietly removed from his administrative duties pending canonical and financial review. He was not defrocked. not excommunicated. But he was sidelined, effectively benched in the middle of what had once been a meteoric spiritual career. Still, the memos raised questions far beyond Tagle. What other cardinals had access to similar financial instruments? Were there more N.Z.T.T. style code systems? Could this be part of a larger network embedded across multiple church departments? As investigators pushed further, connections to other offices began surfacing. One series of memos showed coordination between Tagle's department and a now-defunct Vatican task force on emergency migration. That task force, funded by European Catholic donors, had transferred over $15 million to organizations in Turkey, Syria, and the Balkans. Some of those organizations now appeared to be inactive or deregistered. Others were linked to charitable ventures with ties to powerful business interests in Asia and the Middle East. What began as a singular scandal was now rippling outward, like cracks spidering across the foundation of a marble floor. It was not merely a question of whether Cardinal Tagle had misused church funds. It was a question of whether the church itself had become structurally complicit in creating the very financial fog it claimed to be cleaning up. Back in Rome, Pope Leo XIV remained deliberate and silent. No more leaks were sanctioned. No additional documents released. The Vatican's press office held its ground. The Pope refused to name Tagle in public, opting instead to focus on restoring sacred integrity to the treasury of the Lord. Yet within the halls of the Curia, a quiet battle had begun. Some cardinals rallied in defense of Tagle, calling for a halt to the investigations. Others called for public hearings, even canonical trials. And in the middle stood Leo XIV, resolute, quiet, and, perhaps for the first time in decades, in complete control of a crisis that had already changed the future of the Catholic Church. As we move into the next chapter, the question turns from documentation to direction. Where did the money actually go? And more importantly, who was truly benefiting from the web of NGOs, shell accounts, and coded transactions? Was Tagle alone, or just one visible piece of a much larger, darker puzzle? At the heart of every financial scandal, beyond the personalities and politics, lies one undeniable truth: the numbers do not lie. And in the Vatican's case, it was the numbers, quietly recorded, carefully itemized, and eventually leaked, that began to unravel the meticulously crafted image of one of its most celebrated leaders. The receipts, once analyzed, painted a story far more unsettling than initial allegations. It wasn't just about poor financial oversight or spiritual idealism gone wrong. It was about an orchestrated pattern of global fund movements that appeared to serve purposes far outside the mission of the Church. Once Operation Pius, the confidential audit ordered by Pope Leo XIV, began assembling hard data, a new picture emerged. Investigators didn't start with assumptions, they started with bank transactions. Using Vatican-issued financial statements, SWIFT wire transfer logs, third-party audit trails, and account numbers linked to intermediary faith-based organizations, they began to draw lines that extended across oceans and continents, forming a spider web of hidden movement. The first breadcrumb came from an unusual transaction, a $450,000 donation sent from a Vatican-held account known as Evangel Outreach 6 to a supposed faith-based charity named Mercy Hand International, registered in Nairobi, Kenya. At first glance, it seemed standard. Nairobi was home to several Catholic missions, and Mercy Hand had submitted documentation listing its mission as direct relief for impoverished Catholic families in rural East Africa. However, when auditors contacted local dioceses, no bishop, priest, or mission worker had heard of the charity. Their office was listed as a co-working space in a commercial complex. No chapel, no visible staff, no public programs. Digging deeper, the audit team discovered that Mercy Hand International had two directors, one a former Filipino political operative who had previously been investigated for money laundering in the late 2000s, and the other a Swiss national connected to a Dubai-based logistics firm previously flagged for questionable government contracts. The $450,000 had been received by Mercy Hand and withdrawn within 48 hours in 3 tranches, split between an Emirati personal account, a Luxembourg offshore trust, and a Hong Kong-based brokerage firm. This one transaction became the model that investigators used to analyze others. What they found was a systematic pattern. First, funds were routed through a Vatican-held outreach account, often under the auspices of a regional missionary initiative. Then, they were wired to NGOs with little or no operational footprint. Those NGOs would quickly transfer the funds to unrelated corporate entities, offshore accounts, or third-party brokers. In one especially egregious case, $3.4 million was sent to an organization named Harmony Faith Collective, listed as a cultural ministry in South Korea. The organization, according to its documents, sought to bridge East-West spiritual practices and was supposedly running outreach programs for young Catholics in the countryside. However, records revealed it had never held a single event, service, or mission. The bank used by Harmony Faith Collective was tied to a known facilitator of Chinese state-backed investments. One of the organization's founders was the cousin of a Southeast Asian billionaire known for funding pro-Beijing propaganda efforts across Asia-Pacific. The audit team now had a clearer hypothesis. Someone within the Vatican's missionary structure was using official church accounts and Catholic legitimacy to fund a hidden network of NGOs that served geopolitical, personal, or corporate agendas. While the trail didn't directly implicate Cardinal Tagle in drafting each transaction, his signature, and more often, digital authorization, was found on over 65% of the transfer initiation forms. Another pivotal moment in the investigation came when the auditors discovered a secondary set of side ledgers kept unofficially by a mid-level staffer in the dicastery for evangelization. This staffer, fearing that internal procedures were being abused, had begun documenting unusual financial requests made directly from Tagle's office. These records included not only internal transfer requests but also handwritten notes and follow-up instructions from intermediaries. One such note instructed the staffer to approve a $920,000 grant to Lumen's Voice Network, a religious radio initiative in Bosnia-Herzegovina, with the postscript, "Donor requires discretion. Use alternate authorization path." The money was approved, sent, and within a week, redirected from the Bosnian NGO's account to a cryptocurrency wallet address in the Cayman Islands. These receipts were not vague suspicions. They were timestamped, logged, and layered with authorization codes tied to Vatican systems. What alarmed investigators most was the consistency with which these transactions avoided detection for years. The amounts were always just below reporting thresholds. The recipients were registered entities, even if barely operational. The donor justifications, though thin, used religious language that discouraged deeper scrutiny. Words like evangelical outreach, emergency spiritual response, intercultural dialogue became shields against accountability. To confirm their suspicions, auditors contacted banks across 4 countries under a Vatican-brokered financial cooperation agreement. At first, most institutions refused comment, citing client confidentiality. But after direct intervention by Leo XIV and his legal delegation, some agreed to limited data sharing. What emerged was even more troubling. Several of the funds routed through these church-linked NGOs ended up financing real estate acquisitions in cities like Dubai, Manila, and Budapest. Some were tied to shell corporations that shared owners with individuals who had met with Tagle during his official foreign visits. In one case, a Filipino businessman who publicly supported Catholic missions was listed as the beneficiary of an apartment complex purchased 3 weeks after receiving a Vatican donation intended for faith infrastructure in rural Philippines. It wasn't just the money. It was the pattern, the speed, the documentation. Everything pointed to a coordinated operation where church money was weaponized not to feed the poor or evangelize the marginalized, but to build power bases, bankroll loyalty, and possibly reward alliances. Forensics teams eventually tracked over $65 million in suspect transfers during Tagle's tenure, distributed through 21 countries and involving 34 NGOs or associated entities. While not all the funds were conclusively tied to wrongdoing, over 80% of the recipients failed to provide financial reports or post-program audits, a direct violation of church finance protocol. Meanwhile, internal communications obtained through decrypted emails revealed a chilling level of awareness. In one email chain from 2021, a Vatican officer asked for clarification on a series of transactions to the Bridge of Light Foundation in Indonesia. A response from a supervisor read, "Do not delay the transfer. Benefactor is time-sensitive. Authorization already granted above your level." Above your level. Those words signaled the power structure shielding the operation. Any attempt to challenge the movement of funds was met with hierarchical silencing. In time after time, the final approvals pointed back to the desk of Cardinal Luis Tagle. Still, Pope Leo XIV, wary of inflaming tensions within the College of Cardinals, refrained from making public accusations. Instead, he escalated the internal tribunal process and submitted the evidence to a Vatican commission charged with enforcing canon law on financial integrity. At the same time, he expanded Operation Pius to include further investigations into any department with ties to global NGO partnerships. Outside the Vatican, public scrutiny intensified. Several journalists published the receipts in detail. Graphs were created mapping the movement of funds. Some of these were picked up by financial transparency watchdogs, who launched their own investigations. International pressure grew. Governments in Austria, the Philippines, and Malta opened inquiries into the registered NGOs tied to Vatican money. In Italy, public prosecutors began reviewing real estate holdings purchased by Catholic-linked entities in Rome and Milan. Cardinal Tagle, for his part, remained mostly silent. He released a brief statement through a church outlet in the Philippines, saying, "I have always served the Church with an open heart and clear conscience. I welcome the light of truth and trust in the integrity of the Church's process." He made no reference to the receipts, no explanation of the financial gaps, and took no questions from reporters. Back inside Vatican walls, the Pope's inner circle met daily. There were discussions about whether to refer the matter to international financial courts or to handle everything within the Church's canonical jurisdiction. Some feared that going public would destroy what little moral credibility the Church had left. Others believed that burying the truth would only delay a larger reckoning. Yet the truth, at this point, was already laid bare. The receipts told the story that no words could obscure. They were the confession written in numbers, traced across bank accounts and ghost organizations, immune to manipulation. They documented a systemic breach, not just of financial protocol, but of trust. And perhaps even worse, they showed how easily sacred funds, meant for charity, hope, and healing, could be funneled into the hands of brokers, profiteers, and political operatives. In the eyes of the Vatican's auditors, this wasn't just a case of one cardinal's moral failing. It was a warning about the vulnerability of church structures to exploitation from within. Systems created to move money quickly to those in need had been hijacked because trust replaced transparency and reputation overrode accountability. The question now was not whether the receipts were real. It was what the Church would do next. As we move forward, we enter the territory of foreign politics, donor influence, and NGO warfare. Who funded this system and who benefited behind the scenes? The money moved somewhere. Someone profited. And those names are starting to surface. As Operation Pius expanded beyond mere numbers and spreadsheets, the investigators began encountering a new and far more dangerous dimension to the case. What initially appeared to be financial irregularities confined to church operations had now begun to take on a darker, geopolitical character. Cardinal Tagle's alleged shadow network of charities and offshore fund transfers was not merely a case of spiritual figures mismanaging Vatican donations. The receipts hinted at something far more sinister, a convergence of spiritual authority, political agendas, and foreign influence campaigns that extended far beyond church boundaries. By mid-2024, the audit had compiled hundreds of pages linking Vatican-directed funds to international NGOs that were, in practice, not operating religious missions, but functioning as silent conduits for politically sensitive donations. These NGOs, while cloaked in Catholic language and branded with crosses and Latin mottos, had extensive board ties to political consultants, ex-diplomats, and corporate strategists. And once the financial team began cross-referencing the backgrounds of these NGO stakeholders, they uncovered startling connections to foreign governments and intelligence-linked entities. The first such connection was unearthed from a string of transactions linked to an NGO called Faith Horizons Southeast, which was purportedly focused on disaster relief in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. According to Vatican records, over $6.3 million had been routed to this group over a span of 3 years. However, bank data indicated that less than 15% of those funds were ever withdrawn within those countries. Instead, the majority was rerouted through an account at an investment bank in Qatar, an institution known for handling both legitimate and highly confidential transfers for state-level actors. Faith Horizons Southeast Director, according to corporate filings, was a dual citizen of the Philippines and Singapore, who had previously worked as a liaison officer between Southeast Asian Catholic missions and a now-defunct government-backed economic advisory group in Beijing. Investigators traced this person's financial activity and discovered large asset deposits aligning with donation schedules from the Vatican. The suspicion grew. Were Vatican funds meant for evangelization and charity being funneled into geopolitical influence operations? Even more alarming was what emerged from a Vatican-sanctioned metadata investigation into digital correspondence from Tagle's office. Using forensic recovery software, auditors restored deleted email threads between senior officials of the dicastery and individuals tied to a European lobbying consortium known as Eurobridge Alliance. The emails discussed ensuring goodwill continuity in strategic regions and referenced faith diplomacy as a mechanism for maintaining stable political access. One recovered message mentioned anticipated alignment in policy goals with donor state actors and listed priority countries: China, UAE, Hungary, Philippines. It was a chilling revelation. Faith-based diplomatic cover had allegedly been used to curry favor with, and in some cases, influence, foreign political environments. Through the guise of religious aid and outreach, Tagle's department appeared to have constructed a soft power machine, deploying spiritual legitimacy to reach places where traditional diplomacy often failed or was resisted. In one now public case, auditors found that an NGO receiving Vatican funds, Mission Roots International, operating in sub-Saharan Africa, had formally partnered with a U.S.-based political action group that focused on preserving traditional religious values and governance. Internal documents from the NGO's European affiliate indicated that it had used some of its Vatican-funded grants not for local missions, but to pay consultants in Brussels and Washington, D.C. to lobby for lenient visa processes for religious delegates, several of whom later appeared on watch lists for political agitation. These individuals were not missionaries. They were not priests. They were not nuns. They were former politicians, civil society actors, and government consultants, posing as religious personnel but operating within circles of influence from Geneva to Jakarta. What's more, these operations may not have been incidental. A separate series of memos obtained by Operation Pius suggested premeditation. A 2018 internal directive, signed by a senior deputy in Tagle's office, instructed finance managers to build alternate cooperative frameworks where church mission objectives overlap with values-based political interests. The phrase values-based political interests became a subject of intense scrutiny. In one flagged file, it was used to justify transferring funds to a media company in Eastern Europe tied to a nationalist political movement promoting Catholic identity and national governance. An organization that had been criticized for its anti-immigrant rhetoric and links to white Christian supremacy. In the Philippines, Tagle's home country, journalists began re-examining his previous partnerships and initiatives. What they found added further fuel to the fire. One of the largest donors to Catholic missionary programs in the region was a prominent businessman with extensive ties to the Duterte and Marcos administrations. This businessman, who had previously been flagged by anti-corruption groups, had funded a local nonprofit connected to Tagle's diocese. That nonprofit had, in turn, received over $4 million from the Vatican for infrastructure evangelization projects. A subsequent audit revealed that none of the listed churches or community centers were built, though the funds were fully dispersed and accounted for in the dicastery's books. When this finding reached the ears of international observers, the scandal ballooned. Analysts and foreign policy experts began questioning whether the church's global footprint, its NGOs, its missionaries, its faith-based aid, had been co-opted as a financial front to enable political operations. The accusations now extended well beyond Vatican mismanagement. They were touching on national sovereignty, foreign interference, and the weaponization of spirituality as soft power. Investigative journalists in Europe and Asia began publishing deep-dive exposés on the links between Tagle's missionary NGOs and known government affiliates. One report revealed that Bridge of Hope Alliance, another Tagle-linked NGO based in Thailand, had received donations from a foundation owned by a Chinese business tycoon with Communist Party ties. This foundation had also made contributions to faith groups in Africa, Latin America, and even within certain immigrant-focused Catholic organizations in Italy and France. A follow-up story alleged that several Vatican-approved funds had gone towards setting up spiritual conferences and evangelization forums that functioned as informal diplomatic back channels. At least 4 such events, the report claimed, were attended not by clergy or Catholic leaders but by political consultants, retired ambassadors, and high-net-worth individuals with intelligence connections. For Pope Leo XIV, the revelations confirmed what he had feared all along. The issue was no longer just about Vatican finances, it was about Vatican sovereignty. The sacred trust that the Church held as a spiritual entity had been compromised, co-opted, and entangled with geopolitical actors who saw in the Church not a sanctuary of faith, but an unparalleled global delivery mechanism, capable of moving influence, funds, and access across borders without the friction of traditional governmental oversight. In a closed-door address to his financial review team, Leo was reported to have said, "We are not just cleaning up accounts. We are exorcising alliances." The Pope expanded Operation Pius to include interviews with national intelligence observers, global financial analysts, and outside advisors from international anti-corruption organizations. Meanwhile, pressure mounted from the international community. The European Central Bank questioned whether Vatican bank operations had compromised EU financial regulations. The United Nations requested a briefing on the alleged misuse of charitable funds tied to humanitarian programs. Some nations threatened to freeze church-affiliated bank accounts pending clarification. Cardinal Tagle, still not formally charged, was moved into a quieter role, described as pastoral sabbatical. He had not left the Church, but his once commanding presence was now virtually invisible. He released no statements. He gave no interviews. Behind the scenes, however, sources say he remained in contact with several bishops, particularly in Asia and Latin America.